Welcome back to the Daily Factor. Now, before we play that clip of President CYRIL Ramaphosa addressing the G7, I would just want to discuss the Muslim COVID-19 stats. Now, Gauteng remains the second highest province with COVID-19 deaths. Last night, 17 new deaths were recorded overall. May Allah grant the marhum Jannatul Firdaus Ameen and grant their qabr with Noor, inshallah. Now, as mentioned, President CYRIL Ramaphosa was invited by the G7 in Cornwall to make an address. Now, South Africa is, of course, not part of the Great Seven, but were invited as guests. Now, the clip that we are going to play you discusses, of course, the economic recovery plan for Africa and also the vaccination plan. And of course, we did hear over the weekend that American President Joe Biden has promised to, of course, assist Africa with vaccination jabs. Here's President CYRIL Ramaphosa from the G7.
The participation of the G7 countries, that are countries in the north, most developed economic countries, where the tool that we have to use to fight the pandemic is manufactured, is devised, and yet on the African continent, we do not have the capability to manufacture this tool. So we brought a message here that we would like to have access to the vaccines as well, so that the people of Africa, whom only 2% have now been vaccinated as opposed to much higher percentages in the north, should also be vaccinated, that we should all have access and there should be equity when it comes to vaccines. And that the vaccine nationalism, because we are dealing with a global pandemic and an emergency, should actually come to an end. And to this end, we're pleased to say that the G7 countries have committed quite a lot of support and assistance in the form of making vaccines available and in some cases allowing exports to go to African countries and indeed other parts of the world. And they've also committed financial support through the COVAX and the ACT-A accelerator, where we are able to pool access to the various processes that we need to fight COVID-19. That having been done, we also raise the issue of giving capacity and capability to countries in the developing economies so that they too should be able to produce their own vaccines, so that it should not continue to be the preserve of the G7 countries. And we argued that as South Africa and India have proposed, we should waive the TRIPS process or measure at the WTO. And what we got here is a commitment that yes, the negotiations should ensue at the WTO. We're rather pleased with this, having amassed more than 100 countries as South Africa and India in support of our proposals. We think there's been progress in the form of enabling the negotiations to happen on the text that should be looked at by all countries. EU has made some proposals, and we have made proposals, and the text is now being negotiated. So that we see as tremendous progress. But at the same time, we've been able to get support on capacitating countries that should be able to start on the process of manufacturing vaccines in the form of finance, in the form of licensing. And so we think a great deal of progress has been made in that regard. So we're looking forward to the negotiations at the WTO. Second issue, of course, as a result of the pandemic, the economies of many countries, including South Africa, have been quite devastated. Economic growth has slumped in many of these countries, on the African continent and our own, and we've proposed that there should be economic assistance, and particularly looking at the IMF special drawing rights, which is a mechanism that can be utilized to shore up the finances of various countries. And we know that there's $650 billion that has been talked of and has been more or less agreed. And we also want access to that so that G7 countries and your more developed economies should donate the rights that they have and have them allocated to countries that do not have those rights. Now, there's talk of making $100 billion available. Initially, it was said to be $33 billion, and we've argued that it should be increased. We are still aiming for at least 25%, which could be in the range of $162 billion. With that, we believe that many economies would be able to have a measure of financial muscle as to be able to address the challenges that they face. The last one which stood out for us was the issue of the planet. Climate change is a challenge that affects many countries around the world, and in Africa, which is the least contributing to global gas emissions, suffers the most. We suffer from droughts, from floods, and from all manner of climate change effects. The participation